welcome Louis, did you want to just sit while Peter introduces you? Thank you. Welcome everybody back to the Writers' House. We're hoping that you'll move up a little bit because there's some empty seats, and then other people who come late can join the seats in the back. Thank you. Our program tonight is being recorded both on audio and video, and we will make both recordings available afterwards. So if you're in touch with us, you'll be able to go back and see those. I just wanted to set up the program, and then Peter Strzok will give a more proper introduction to Mr. Lapham, whom we're very, very excited to have here at the Writers' House. Erwin Applebaum, who's here back there, is a longtime friend of the Writers' House and has made possible what will become an annual series. So, Louis, this is the first of an annual event that will feature an eminent editor, writer/editor, publisher, and we're very excited about this series. So, Erwin, thank you very much for doing this. It's a fantastic thing. The Writers' House does have its share of editors coming through, but this allows us to focus on that, and we're really excited that Louis Lapham is our first speaker in this series. My name is Al Filreis. I'm the faculty director of the Writers' House, and I want to invite all of you after the program to come back into the dining room and the living room and have some fabulous food. Aaron, what's on the menu back there? A Middle Eastern spread. There you go. So please stay for that, and that'll be a good chance to interact informally with our speaker and others who are here. So thank you again for coming to the Writers' House. If this is your first time in the Writers' House, make sure that on your way out you sign our book so that we can be in touch with you about other programs. So Peter Strzok has come all the way from California to be here for this program and do some other things. So I'm glad you're here back to the Writers' House, and here's Peter to more formally introduce our program tonight. So thank you, Peter Strzok.
Thanks, Al. Perhaps the best definition of an intellectual I've heard is someone who bites the hand that feeds him. Over a writing and editing career that spanned 5 decades, Louis Lapham has bitten more hands than have probably fed us all. A 2006 inductee into the Magazine Editors Hall of Fame, Lapham joins names like Helen Gurley Brown, Osborne Elliott, and Tina Brown. But unlike these figures, Lapham has been recognized by his peers as a voice that has most powerfully shaped American journalism, not by titillating, not by engaging with celebrity, and not by offering self-improvement advice. He's done so by taking ideas seriously and by providing a home for his own and others' good writing. Writers have signatures. Some are connoisseurs of individual words. Others think in elegant paragraphs. Lapham's métier is the sentence. Like many, I imagine, I remember first finding Harper's Magazine in college and becoming entirely beguiled by Lapham's style. He welcomes you in, dear reader, to an unhurried frame of mind, a state of being over which he presides like with a kind of curatorial grace. The scene is set with an observation. We come along with Mr. Lapham to the TV producer's office, the Aspen Institute, Mae West's boudoir, or a state dinner at the White House, and then an aside reveals that something is not quite what it should be. An eyebrow is raised, another aside places the first in a more trenchant context, and then the concluding remark, like a scorpion's tail, brings us to the point. If any single theme can be drawn through this long and varied corpus, Lapham has demonstrated an uncompromising impatience with the presumptuous. He will not only not suffer fools, he will tar and feather them and run them out of town on a rail. For this predisposition, he has gathered a bouquet of vociferous interlocutors, usually on the virulent right, who, in my opinion, usually have him entirely wrong. Lapham is in some ways a Tory in the Henry Fairley definition of the term, that is, king and people against the nobility. A son of privilege, he distrusts it. A card-carrying member of the establishment, he saves his sharpest arrows for those in positions of authority. The subject for him is almost never the wholesome American middle, that mythic space through which those on the right like to roam, but rather the character of the wealthy and the powerful. After writing stints at the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Herald Tribune, and the Saturday Evening Post, Lapham spent much of the last 3 decades molding Harper's Magazine into his own image. Irascible and impatient, urbane and knowing, unrelentingly contrarian, the magazine cut against the grain by cherishing voices, individual voices, at a time when journalism by blender was coming of age. Lapham has published and nurtured the thoughtful and the pissed off, those who were motivated more by clear expression than by piety, and cherished openness to new ideas rather than ever cleverer restatements of old ones. He distrusts the collective language that appears in television shows, news magazines, government reports, and advertising copy. Maybe even more than distrusts it, he finds it degrading, and he's not shy about revealing it as such. Lapham has failed utterly at retirement. The ink on his last paycheck from Harper's Magazine was hardly dry before he began making a reality out of a vision he's had for many years. A general interest journal filled with the writing, the ideas, and most of all the singular voices that has shaped his own over the whole history of arts and letters, from Gilgamesh to yesterday and from Lao Tzu to Barbara Ehrenreich. So now as the economy crashes, print dies, and attention spans have shrunk to 140 words, Lapham launches a new venture, handsomely produced, expensively produced, wedded to the technology of the paper folio and dedicated to patient engagement. In other words, he finds himself entirely in the comfortable position of being out of step, and we're all the better for it. Lapham has been on radio with The World in Time on Bloomberg, on internet podcast on iTunes, and on TV with Bookmark and America's Century on PBS, an engagement which, if I recall, was brought to a conclusion with Lewis's authorship over one of my favorite essays, Adieu, Big Bird. And he's the author of dozens of books and a movie script, winner of 14 National Magazine Awards and the 2009 award also for Best New Publication by the Utne Reader, and he's also a biter of thousands of hands. It's my great pleasure to present to you Lewis Lapham.
I, in no way can come up to that introduction, Peter. I appreciate that, and I hope I can borrow some of it, the language. Mostly what I would like to do is answer questions and get into a conversation with whatever it is that is on your mind. I started out in life wanting to become an historian. I went to Yale University in 1956 and then to Cambridge University in England. But I only stayed at Cambridge for a year because I soon understood that I did not have the temperament of a scholar. I didn't have the patience for footnotes, but I enjoyed the reading around in all kinds of subjects. When I came back to the United States after a year, I went into the newspaper business, and I can remember the first assignment. I was assigned, it was the San Francisco Examiner, and I was assigned to the police beat in Oakland, which was then in the City Hall, and had the feeling of front page, the 30s popular notion of newspapermen. And in that same building was the City Hall, the mayor's office, the press room, the jail, and the courts. But my first assignment was to cover a flower show in Piedmont. And I went to cover the flower show and wrote 4,000 words and turned it into Mr. Crowley, who was my senior correspondent in the Oakland, for the San Francisco Examiner in the Oakland press room. And Crowley looked at me and he read the copy, and then he said to me, "These are the most beautiful 4,000 words I have ever read." It was more than I could do not to cry. But do me a favor and see if you, it's a little long, he said, for the paper, see if you can cut it in half. And so, with great anguish, I went and cut it in half. And Crowley read it again and this time even more sentimental. Crowley was Irish, was always wearing a hat. And he said, "Once again, I have wept, but do me a favor and cut it in half again." And we went through this routine until it finally got down to one paragraph in the Sunday paper. And that was my introduction to learning how to edit and also how to write for the newspaper. I spent 3 years in San Francisco and learned how to write shorter sentences, and then came to New York with the New York Herald Tribune, which in 1960, 61, 62 was a truly marvelous newspaper. It put a lot of emphasis on the ability to write. Among the other people on the staff at the same time were Charles Portis, Tom Wolfe, Jimmy Breslin, and it was a lot of fun. But after a while, after a couple of years, I thought I wanted to write at longer length. Newspaper story is 500, 700 words, and I wanted to write 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words. It was the era of the new journalism in the middle 60s in New York. So I became a contract writer for the Saturday Evening Post, which was a wonderful education. I had 6 years at the Post and would travel around the world, really, to write pieces about the America's Cup, about the Beatles in India, and about President Johnson in Washington. And the Post in those days, the transition that's going on in the 60s is the move from print to television. In 1960, the Post, Life magazine were the main instruments of the big media. And if the President of the United States wanted to talk to the American people, he would sit for an interview with Joseph Alsop on the back page of the Post, or with Teddy White on the back page of Life magazine. And of course, by 1970, that had all changed. And if the President wanted to talk to the American people, he would sit down and talk to one of the television people on Meet the Press or Face the Nation. So, but in the middle of the 60s, while the long form in the big magazines was still a plausible form, I traveled. The pieces would be, you'd go somewhere for 3 months or 4 months and take a lot of notes, and then come back and try to turn it into an intelligent narrative. And among the other people at the Post at that same time were both Joan Didion and her husband, John Gregory Dunn, who was, to my mind, one of the best journalists to come out of the 60s. The Post folded. I then went briefly to work for Life magazine, the same kind of deal. Life magazine folded. I then went to Harper's Magazine as a writer, became an editor by accident. It never had occurred to me to become an editor, but there was a Boulevard Small and Office Politics, and it's a familiar story in New York journalism. And so on a Tuesday, I was a writer, and on Wednesday, I was the managing editor. And I stayed there ever since. It so happened that was 1971, and I got married and began to have children. And my prior life as a writer had been one where I could travel at will and spend lots of time out of town, and I couldn't do that anymore. So I learned how to become an editor. I learned from Otto Friedrich, who was the editor at the Saturday Evening Post, and then from a man named Jack Fisher, who was a emeritus editor at Harper's Magazine. And everything I know about editing I learned from those two men. And then I began to teach myself how to write the notebook column, the lead essay for the Harper's Magazine. So that was another form that I had to learn. And I did that for almost 30 years. I also, during the 80s, did some experiment with television, did a television documentary on a history of the American foreign policy in the 20th century. American Power, it was called, in the U.S. and in Britain, it was called the American Century. And that's a completely different form, television. So can't use, irony doesn't work very well on television, and you can't back into sentences with long clauses. It has to, it's kind of subject, verb, object. But I tell you what kind of form it is. During this American Century program, I was given 42 words in 75 seconds to make a bridge between still photographs of Chamberlain in Munich in 1938 and movie footage of the German Stukas bombing Poland in September 1939. And not only did I have to write a bridge between those two photographs, but within the 42 words and 75 seconds explain the origins of World War II. So that's the kind of form it is. When I listen to the current conversations about the internet and goodbye print and so forth, this is a story that I've seen through several phases over the last 40-odd years. So now I have a quarterly magazine that is still reliant on the printed word, although in shorter forms than, I mean, the entries are cut down to anywhere from 50 to 1,500 words. But we have an Allied website which is not a replicant of the magazine. It tries to do something that's analogous, but in the medium of the internet. And now I'm trying to figure out how to learn how to write a blog. I figure that's some kind of an art form, maybe resembling the Japanese haiku, but I'm studying it to see if I can do it. I've done a couple which I'm not happy with yet. But I've been fortunate during my years at Harper's Magazine to have been associated with many extremely talented writers, quite a few of whom I have had the chance to publish for the first time. I've always learned a lot from the people that I've worked with. And I am like the Japanese painter Hokusai when he was 95, or maybe 85, not sure which, but somebody asked him about painting, and he said, when I was 15, I knew I was in love with painting. By the time I was 30, I had begun to learn something about how to do it. when I was 70, I think I understood the first principles. Now I am 85, and by the time I get to be 100, everything I draw, whether it's a dot or a line, will be alive. You who live so long, see if I'm not right. But I have some of the same. I'm still learning how to write. I think my writing is getting better, and certainly I'm learning to edit it more heavily and cut the second adjective, no matter how beautiful it is, and maybe avoid the third Baroque variation on the metaphor. But again, I mean, it's like Casals. Casals was 93, and living in Puerto Rico with a woman who was 45 years younger than himself, and a journalist from New York goes down to interview him and says, "Mr. Casals, you're the most famous cellist in the world, and you're living here in the sun with a woman 45 years younger than yourself. Why do you practice the cello every morning for 4 hours?" And Casals said, "Because I'm learning something." And that's what I am still doing. Ask me any question, and I will have an attempt at an answer. Yes, yeah.
I've noticed in the quarterly, it's very often university-based historians or contributors.
Yeah.
How do you get them to not go on too much at length?
Oh, you mean in the back? You mean you mean among the younger? I mean among the living authors in the back? Well, I simply tell them that the limit is 3,000 words. And then if they then go on longer than that, I show them that perhaps if they left this digression out, they'd still have their argument. And it's a matter of persuasion. But that's the other thing. I mean, to be an editor, it's a matter of cajoling and wheedling and trying to get the writer to see it get the writer to see that the manuscript could be better. Most writers that welcome that kind of editing. The difference between a good writer and a bad writer is that at least one of the differences is that the good writer tends to, it's been my experience, tends to have an idea that is out there or up there, or he's trying, or she is trying to get to a point just over the horizon. And if you can help the writer get there and read his manuscript closely enough and carefully enough to see what it is that he or she is trying to do and help them do it, they are grateful. It tends to be the second-rate writer who is concentrated on his or her own ego, and that gets in the way of the idea that, or the phrase, or the thought that they're trying to get to. So I learn how to show the writer that the change is in his or her own best interest. Yes. Yeah.
What is the future of publishing? Is it wise to self-publish and go on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, put your book there, even though you have to pay? Because editors are turning things back without even looking at them, mostly.
Well, I think as the means of production become cheaper, yes, there's no reason not to do it that way.
It's a good idea?
it's probably the only idea. I mean, if you can't get it published by an established publisher, that would be a way of doing it, and you actually have a chance, maybe, of finding an audience. People find audiences now through the internet, through the blog, and then you saw 3 days ago or 4 days ago in the Times, there was a story about the Daily Beast, which is a website started a year ago by Tina Brown, who had been the editor of Vanity Fair and the New Yorker. And this is a collection of blogs. And then her idea is to turn the blogs into books within a matter of 3 months, because the delay in publishing is at least, as it is now, can be as long as a year. So she's trying to get over that, make it easier to publish the book, and maybe to publish the book in a short form, 140 pages, pamphlet. Yeah, and Hewlett Packard has got a new system where you can print books, very high-speed press, color, in any dimensions that you want, in any number that you want, very cheaply. Your problem then is distribution. But Leonard Riggio, who is the man who owns Barnes & Noble and is one of the investors in the Quarterly, there are 750 Barnes & Noble bookstores in the country today, and Riggio thinks there might, in 10 years, there may be 20. So they're all different, and nobody really knows at this point in time. There's a lot of experiment going on as how to publish and in what form, and then how to distribute it. These are questions that not only individual writers are asking, but big corporations. They're trying to control the means of distribution. Yes, sir.
Well, given that, with your perspective, you've been able to make a living as both writer, editor, and effectively publisher. Just curious about your thoughts then about where does the prospective writer, editor make a living? Where does the money come from in a world where distribution now is easier than it's ever been before? But if there are 20 Barnes and Nobles, where is the working writer going to get a living wage?
I don't know. The point is that relatively few writers make a living wage. I mean, today, or even 20 years ago, or even in 1950. And Penn has compiled a list of the relative salaries of writers, and writers that are trying to live on their writing are, it's a pittance mostly. I mean, I could never have supported myself as a writer. I had to work also as an editor. There are, of course, people on the order of Stephen King and Danielle Steele and maybe Thomas Friedman. I mean, and it's a relatively small list. A few hundred that could make what would be considered a decent living. And then, of course, it also depends on what you consider to be how you define writing. If you write a 17-page prospectus for a leveraged buyout deal that comes in at $20 billion, your share of that action is going to be a good way ahead of what Norman Mailer ever made. I mean, it's the people that write television commercials or think up brand name slogans, which is truly a form of poetic haiku. But if you're talking about literature, there's never been a big market for that in the U.S. I mean, if you go back into the 19th century.
No, but there were more paths to follow. Newspapers.
Yeah, I mean, sure, I mean, yeah, before television, yeah, no, that's true. And they had a bigger.
More paths and usually you can get your work up immediately and get it seen theoretically by the world. Distribution is always
Yeah.
is the key, but somewhere getting now distribution is possible, but getting money for that distribution.
Well, nobody has figured that one out yet. I mean, Salon, Slate, the Huffington Post, Tina's Daily Beast, none of those operations yet are making money. Although Tina will pay well for the people that write her blogs. That's because she's being supported by Barry Diller and can afford it. I mean, she's making a bet that some of this will come back to her. There are, if you wanted to make money as sports writing, if you could write for Sports Illustrated or ESPN magazine, they pay extremely well. There's some people on staff that make as much as $500,000 a year for both those magazines. But you're right, it's a small market, and nobody has really yet figured out how the writer gets paid on the internet. Maybe there'll be you do your own marketing. I'm going to try that with if I can establish the quarterly and turn it into a profit-bearing enterprise, which it has a chance of doing. We started out with a circulation 2 years ago of 6,000, and now it's 25,000. And if that trend can wax and prosper, I have a notion of setting up an adjunct publishing of out-of-print books. Most of them would be history. The New York Review does this with belles lettres, and they do it very well. And I would try to do the same thing with historical texts, pamphlets, and so forth. Not necessarily very long. I mean, it could be 100 pages, 150 pages. And I'd probably, print all my own books. I mean, I've written 13. None of them have made any money. But I could publish them in a elegant, cheap paper edition. Myself, I prefer the paper book edition to the hardback, and do the kind of thing that the lady in the fifth row suggests. I mean, we beginning to have the technology and the capability of doing those kind of things. Most big publishing companies are very wasteful. I mean, they take a great deal of the profit into administrative costs and so forth, and very seldom does the money get back to the writer. It doesn't come down to the bottom line. It's like a movie deal. Yeah.
I have a feeling that Thomas Nash would have understood this conversation we've been having perfectly well, minus the 400 years of technology. But I wanted to ask you about another question that
Yeah.
relates to some of your own political writings that I've
Yeah.
enjoyed. About a year ago, it seemed to some people that the country was ripe for a new progressive era of some sort, and that Obama, whatever his shortcomings might be, a vehicle for that. And at this point, it seems that moment is somehow passing.
Well, I think that certainly the expectation and the hope of a transforming, progressive change was behind a great deal of the enthusiasm for Obama, as reflected in the MoveOn.org campaign. A number of young people that were willing to work for him, wanted to work for him everywhere in the country. I think, if you remember, soon after he was elected, something like 15,000 people had volunteered to work at some task within the government, and you are that. Certainly, that feeling was there among large numbers of people. Obama, however, on his record, I didn't share that feeling. Because I saw in Obama, mostly on his record, as a very much of a get along, go along politician, very, very good at it. I mean, speaks well, command of rhetoric, and likable, attractive media presence, but not confrontational, not to do the kind of transformation that many of his adherents and supporters hope for, would require pissing a lot of people off, and that was not in Obama's, wasn't then, isn't now in his character. I mean, to see him go down about whatever it was 2 weeks ago and talk to the Wall Street figures gathered in they were down there in Federal Hall or someplace, and he was giving them a lecture. He was saying, we have to get beyond the days of, what was his phrase, open greed and bloated bonuses. He had something like that, but that is, those people are in Wall Street because of the bloated bonuses and for the mindless greed. That's what they're doing there. I mean, to give that kind of a lecture is, I thought was a little misplaced. I mean, it's I talked to an historian at about the time that Obama was being elected, or just after he'd been elected, when he was coming in inauguration. I was talking to a man who'd written a history of a biography of Martin Luther King, and there were comparisons between Obama and King. That was one of the popular themes on the op-ed page of the New York Times, and I asked this historian about the comparison, and he laughed. He said, well, somehow I just can't see Obama in the Birmingham jail. That's really all you have to know about the guy, I think. I mean, he'll try to make some modest change on the fringe of the political apparatus, and maybe that's all you can do in the United States. This is a very conservative country. We don't really have a lot of radicals. I went to hear the other night at Barnes & Noble in New York, listened to Ralph Nader, who's got a new book called Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, which is a complicated and ill-conceived form of what is in fact a radical screed. But to read Nader, and he lays it out chapter and verse very, very clearly. I mean, he's very, very good, I think, as a progressive thinker who would if given a chance, or at least he knows how reform has to be brought about, and he knows how hard it is, and he knows how many enemies you have to make. Nader himself couldn't do it. I mean, he's a good journalist, but he's not. He would be a hopeless politician or president. And I've told him that. I said, Ralph, for God's sake, don't run for president. Run for Senate for Connecticut, because he is extremely eloquent.
So your conclusion is that the progressive moment is really an illusion? That this
It is. Yeah, that is my conclusion. That the progressive moment was a matter of wishful thinking. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the writer David Foster Wallace?
Foster Wallace,
I
what?
love some of the pieces you guys published, but I never got the sense that he really liked editors. So can you talk about editing him?
Oh, you did? No, you didn't have to. No, you didn't have to edit Foster Wallace. Foster Wallace is one of those guys that they're few and far between. You could ask him. I would never fool around with his copy. Same Updike is like that too. Updike's copy would come in absolutely clean. I mean, you wouldn't have to change a comma. I could say to Foster Wallace, we only have 12 pages for this particular piece. Could you find it in your heart to take 2 pages out? And because with Wallace, you always knew it was going to come out somewhere later. I mean, if all of it didn't make the magazine, it would show up in a book or in a collection of essays. And usually he'd do that. On the other hand, you hated to cut anything. At least that was my experience with him. I think if I was the editor of Infinite Jest, I might have tried to be a little bit more severe. But I didn't get all the way through it. I mean,
It's good at the end.
yeah, he was a wonderful writer. Yeah.
How do you envision the quarterly being read? Like, how do you envision people picking up and going about reading it? Kind of just like a magazine?
Yeah, no, it's like a magazine. You pick it up and you pick around in it, right? I mean, you don't have to read it from beginning to end. You might want to read the introductory essay, which sets up the premise and tells you what the thing's trying to do. But after that, you can pick around in it, just the way that the dates and places are juxtaposed. I mean, you'll find something from 478 A.D. next to something from 1836, and next to something from 330 B.C. I tend to read that way anyway, and I think that is also the way people who are accustomed to television and to the internet tend to approach texts. This is the point that McLuhan makes in Understanding Media. The translation from, I mean, the transition from print to the electronic media brings about, we shape our tools and our tools shape us, says McLuhan. And just like the revolution in the 15th century with Gutenberg, so the revolution with the electric light, according to McLuhan, turns over, overthrows a settled political and aesthetic order. Print, in his terms, is visual, and the electronic media are visceral. And it's a different kind of I grew up in the world of print, but my sons, my children, grow up in a world where they're used to working on a computer and listening to music at the same time. I could have never done that when I was 14. I still can't do that. But I've seen people who can. So you can read it. You can read around in it. But the electronic media go around. I mean, it's circular. It's not linear.
Maybe time for one last question? I'm curious, you said you have something on the web with the quarterly. How do you see a relationship there? I mean, do you transpose things? Do you just put short things on? What, and as you're trying to learn to write a blog,
Yeah.
how are you mentally approaching it? It's like going between two pictures with 42 words. What's sort of your mental take on how do I get inside that reader and come back out of the screen?
Well, first of all, okay, a couple of the things that we do on the web, you can't do in print. We have something called Deja Vu, where we will take something right from the news and then do a dissolve, literally dissolve, the way a film will, both with the image and with the text. So that there was some story a couple of months ago about a writer saying something offensive and essentially being sent home to have his mouth washed out with soap because he'd made some politically incorrect statement. So we had the statement, the news clip, and then we had the picture of the writer. And the dissolve takes you back to the Earl of Rochester, who, at the court of Charles II, he was in great favor for a while, and he was the court poet. And one day he's at court, and the king asks him for a new poem, and the Earl makes a mistake of giving the king the wrong poem. And the poem that he gives him is one that is a savage attack on the king. And mocking the king's sexual tastes and appurtenances. And so he was dismissed from court. And he was disgraced. I mean, he lost his patronage, disappeared into the country. So we're doing that again with a story this week about NFL football players suffering mental damage and taking that back to Walter Camp, who invented football at Yale in 1886, and football was played in those days was a very dangerous game. I mean, in the year 1899, 15 kids were killed on the field. They didn't wear helmets. And Camp is defending the, anyway, it works. So we go back to we go back from the NFL to the Harvard-Yale game. We go back from the statements of who's ever I don't know who the president of the NFL is today, but to Walter Camp. And you can do that with a lot of things. We do that with, it's a wonderful feature. And then we put in commentary from readers who write in and say, I notice in your issue that you've said this about the Roman Empire, but I will now tell you why the Roman Empire fell. And we put that up. And I also do a radio show for Bloomberg with historians, once a week, and that goes up on the, on the audio part. And then we have another audio device where in a given issue we will find various prominent people to read from the issue. So we've got Calvin Trillin or James Franco or Garrison Keillor. We have a lot of people reading Aristophanes and Shakespeare. You see, and that goes. So it's a different. Medium. And part of the reason is necessity, because when you buy second serial, most of what we print is second serial, and it's relatively cheap. There are a few exceptions, but they don't sell you the electronic right. So we're not free to. We can put to put it up. In some cases we are, but not in all cases. So the website has to be something of its own master. Fortunately, I have some young people in the office who know how to do this. Yes.
Maybe one last question.
Okay.
If you were to name like one or two things that you're doing differently or paying more attention to at Quarterly than in your tenure at Harper's, what would that be?
Well, to me, this is sheer pleasure, because I'm getting to read A-list manuscripts. If I'm reading Gibbon or Shakespeare or Tolstoy or the various contributors, my only criterion is the writing any good? I mean, I'm not trying to give it definitive or comprehensive historical overview. And at Harper's Magazine, very often what you were dealing with was a C+ manuscript that you then had to try to bring up to the level of at least a B+, possibly an A. So you would spend, if I took home a briefcase at night in which I had 10 manuscripts, maybe one of them would be a Foster Wallace type manuscript, which you could just put into the magazine without harming a hair on its head. And then 3 would be ones that could be made to work if the writer would agree to it, and if the lead paragraph was moved from page 7 to page 1, that kind of thing. And then the other 5 were hopeless. But you still had to read them, because often they had been assigned somebody, either by myself or one of my editors. So you owe the writer the courtesy of finishing the magazine, the manuscript, and telling him or her what's the matter with it. But I don't have to do any of that. Now I can just pick it up, and I know I'm in the company of angels, and that's a real pleasure.